Don't fuck with my money. That's what I told myself the night everything fell apart. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. See, I wasn't some punk kid looking for drama. I was a tech, one of those nerds who could pull apart a computer blindfolded and put it back together before you finished your coffee. I'd spent years building my reputation from the ground up, while my boss, George, spent his nights sniffing around bars and pretending to be the next Steve Jobs. He had the money, the cars, the flashy suits, and the ego to match. But behind all that shine, he was rotten. Back in the 90s, computers were gold. Everyone wanted one, and every business needed someone who could make them work. That was me. I worked for George's small computer shop, the kind of place that smelled like burnt solder and stress. I started out fixing walk-ins, replacing power supplies, building towers for local businesses. I was good at it, damn good. I could diagnose a system just by the sound it made when it booted. George knew it too. He'd brag about me to clients like I was some prized racehorse. "This is my best guy," he'd say, clapping me on the shoulder. "He's the one who keeps this place running." And I did. He paid me decently at first. Not amazing, but enough. Then, I started doing on-site work. That's where the real money was. A client's network would crash, and they'd panic. I'd show up, fix it, save the day. George and I had a deal. I'd get 30% of whatever the on-site job brought in. He'd take 70%. That arrangement made sense, until I started realizing I was the one doing all the real work while he was cashing the bigger checks. Still, I didn't complain. I kept my head down, built my client relationships, and made him a ton of money. Then one day, I noticed something off. I was setting up a new office network, 10 computers and a server, and I realized the motherboards and the machines weren't the same brand I'd listed on the invoice. The customer had paid for top-tier hardware, but George had swapped in cheap knockoffs. I confronted him. "George," I said, "you're shortchanging them. This isn't what they paid for." He smirked and said, "Relax, man. I make another $40 per workstation using these boards. It's good business." Good business? No, that was fraud. Half those systems failed during setup, just like I warned him they would. I hauled them back myself, shoved them on the counter, and told him he was going to replace every damn one. He acted like I'd kicked his dog. But he did it, not because he cared, but because he knew I wasn't bluffing. After that, I started watching him closely. The shady stuff got worse. I walked into the shop one morning and saw the build team cloning hard drives, preloaded with Windows and Office, and reinstalling them across every system. That might not sound like a big deal now, but back then, that was serious piracy. He was selling illegal software to every client who walked through the door. I asked where the licenses were, and he just waved his hand like it didn't matter. Then one day, I lost a client, a big one. They'd bought a dozen computers from us, plus a server. George had sold them cloned systems without the product keys or certificates. The client called me personally, furious, said they'd been trying to get the keys for weeks, and George kept saying they were on back order. That's when I snapped. I drove to the shop, walked straight to the cabinet where we kept the license slips, and sure enough, unlocked. I grabbed what that client had already paid for and took it to them myself. When I walked back in, George was red-faced and shouting, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I stared him down and said, "Getting the customer what they paid for. Don't worry, I'll get a receipt signed." He didn't like that, but deep down, I think he knew I was right. That's when I realized this place wasn't just sketchy anymore. It was toxic, and my name was attached to it. I started insisting that every system I worked on had legitimate software before I even touched it. George hated that. It slowed him down, made his little shortcuts harder to pull off. The tension built between us like static before a storm. Still, I kept showing up. I needed the paycheck. At the time, I was pulling around 50 grand a year from my 30% cut, which meant George was easily making that and more off my back. Then came the moment that lit the fuse. He called me into his office one morning. That cramped space that always smelled like whiskey and cheap air freshener, and said, "Hey, I think I need to start charging you for your cell phone." Now, back in the 90s, having a company cell phone meant you were on call, basically 24/7. Most employers paid for that because they owned your time. I looked at him and said, "All right, that's fine, but if I'm paying for my own phone, I'll want 35% of the on-site fees." He laughed. Actually laughed. Then said, "Nah, I was thinking of dropping you to 25%. You know, make you an independent contractor." I just stood there, stunned. My jaw literally locked for a second. He looked at me like he'd just made a brilliant business move. But what he'd really done was light the fuse on his own downfall. I didn't say a word. I just walked out. I went across the street to a bar, ordered a beer, and sat there for 2 hours trying to process it. 2 hours of staring at nothing while people laughed around me thinking, after everything I've done for that guy, this is what I get? When the beer ran out, I switched to water and kept thinking. By the time the bartender asked if I wanted another, I already knew what I had to do. If George wanted to treat me like an independent contractor, then fine. I'd be one. But I'd be independent for real. I spent the next day driving to my clients in person. Not calling, not emailing, driving. I wasn't going to risk using the company phone. I sat down with each one, explained that I was leaving the company, and asked if they'd stick with me if I went solo. And you know what they said? Of course. George wasn't the one fixing our systems at 5 a.m. You were. 12 clients. 12 solid accounts. Locked in. The next morning, I walked into George's shop for the last time. I handed him my phone, my charger, my badge, everything. He looked at me like he didn't understand. What's this? He asked. I quit, I said, and I walked out. That should have been the end of it. But of course George wasn't done being George. The next day was payday. I was expecting a little over $2,000. When the checks came out, mine wasn't there. I walked straight into his office and said, "Where's my paycheck?" He didn't even look up. Just muttered, "I don't owe you anything." I stood there, trying not to lose it. "You're sure about that?" I said. "Because if you don't pay me, I promise, you'll lose a hell of a lot more than $2,000. He smirked and said, "Get out." So I did. But that was the last quiet day George ever had, because the next chapter of this story, that's when the real revenge began. After that day, something inside me flipped. All the frustration, all those nights staying late to fix George's messes, they turned into fuel. I wasn't just quitting a job. I was burning the bridge so completely that nobody could ever walk back across it. I didn't have a logo, a website, or even a company name yet, but I had what mattered: trust. Those 12 clients I'd talked to, they weren't just customers. They were the reason I'd been waking up before sunrise all those years. And now they were mine. I started from my kitchen table, literally. I bought a used phone, got a cheap answering machine, and printed business cards at Kinko's with a name I came up with at 2 a.m. Silverline Technologies. It sounded legit, maybe even bigger than I was. That was the goal. Fake it till you make it. The first few weeks were chaos. I was working 14-hour days, half the time driving from one client to another, fixing network issues out of my trunk. I didn't have fancy tools or a team. Hell, I didn't even have a proper office chair, just one that squeaked every time I leaned back. But you know what? I was free. No shady boss, no stolen software, no more dealing with George's nonsense. And every time I cashed a check from a client who'd once belonged to him, it felt like justice in slow motion. But here's the thing about guys like George. They can't stand watching someone they used to control succeed without them, especially when that success reminds them how replaceable they really were. It started small. Clients would call and say, "Hey, George came by. He said you're using pirated software now. Said you cut corners." I remember the first time I heard that. I just laughed. The irony was so thick it could have been a commercial. George, of all people, accusing me of using pirated software? That's like a pickpocket calling someone a thief. Still, I brushed it off. I figured people would see through it. I had real relationships with my clients, not just sales pitches. But George wasn't stopping. Word spread, whispers, rumors, and I realized he was trying to poison my reputation before my business could even grow. For a while, it worked. Some potential clients backed out. One small office I'd just landed called to cancel their service, saying, "We heard you're using the same shady installs George used." That one hurt. I sat there staring at the cancellation letter, jaw tight, hands shaking, because I hadn't done a damn thing wrong. That's when I decided, fine. If George wanted to play dirty, I'd stop pretending to be the good guy. I didn't go looking for revenge, but when it came knocking, I opened the door and invited it in. The first step was simple: information. I knew every single thing about how George ran his business, where he kept his install media, how he labeled his cloned drives, which vendors he cheated, which clients had been sold unlicensed software. I'd been there. I'd seen it all. And there was one group that really didn't like guys like George, the BSA, Business Software Alliance. Back then, they were like the FBI for software piracy. Microsoft, Adobe, Symantec, all the big names were part of it. If you got caught selling unlicensed copies of their software, they didn't just slap your wrist. They'd crush you. So I called them. At first, I wasn't sure they'd care. I mean, I was just some ex-employee from a local computer shop. But when I explained what George had been doing, cloning activated Windows drives, reselling pirated Office licenses, keeping the original certificates locked away, the rep on the other end got very, very interested. They asked for everything. Dates, client names, invoices, even the model numbers of the machines we'd sold. And man, I gave them everything. I wasn't angry anymore. I was surgical, cold, focused. They thanked me and said they'd investigate. I figured it would take a few months, maybe nothing would happen. Still, it felt good. Like finally putting a bullet in the stress that guy had caused me. Meanwhile, my own company started to pick up steam. Clients loved that I was honest and fast. Word of mouth spread, and before I knew it, I was booked solid. I wasn't making a fortune, but I was clearing around 45 grand a year after expenses, which was basically what I'd been making under George. Only now, every dollar I earned was mine. I was working harder than ever, but it felt different. It felt like building something instead of surviving something. Then, about a year later, Karma decided to send me a little love letter. It was a Saturday morning. I was flipping through the local paper with my coffee when a headline jumped out at me. Local computer chain hit with $1 million fine for software piracy. I froze. The photo underneath? George's shop, his logo, his smug face. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee all over the table. Turns out the BSA had sent secret shoppers posing as customers. They bought computers, inspected the hard drives, and found hundreds, literally hundreds, of cloned installations of Microsoft Office and Windows. All activated, all illegal. The article said the company had been charged for distributing hundreds of unlicensed software copies, and as part of the settlement, they had to shut down 2 of their 3 stores and pay a 7-figure fine. George had gone from local computer mogul to broke overnight. The poetic part, I didn't even have to lift a finger after that phone call. All I did was tell the truth. And the truth did the heavy lifting. For weeks, people called me. Old co-workers, clients, even some of George's former suppliers. Everyone wanted to know if I'd seen the story. I'd just smile and say, "Yeah, I saw it." Some of them whispered, "Did you have something to do with it?" And I'd just laugh. "Nah," I'd say. Karma's got a good memory. But inside, it felt damn good. Still, the weird thing about revenge, even when it works perfectly, is that it doesn't always feel complete. You get justice, sure. You get closure. But a part of you still carries the memory of how badly someone burned you. You don't forget the sting. You just learn to live above it. George lost his stores, his reputation, and his big talk. I gained peace, and honestly, that's worth way more than a paycheck. But this story didn't just end with me walking away smiling. There's one last piece, the part where everything came full circle. Because karma? Sometimes she lets you watch the encore. After the article hit, the whole town buzzed. You couldn't walk into a coffee shop without overhearing someone mention George's name, always followed by a laugh or a serves him right. People love a downfall, especially when the guy at the top thought he was untouchable. But for me, it wasn't about celebrating his failure. It was about finally being free from the weight of his lies. For years, I'd carried his mistakes on my back, covering for him, fixing the messes he created just to keep the shop's reputation clean. Now the world could see what I'd seen all along. I didn't post about it. I didn't brag. I didn't even call anyone. I just went to work like usual, grabbed a black coffee from the gas station down the street, and started another day of service calls. But every once in a while, I'd pass by his old storefront, the one with the flickering computers and networks sign, and the windows would be dark. A for lease sign hung where his logo used to be. I'd slow down just long enough to smile, not a big grin, not a laugh, just a quiet little nod, because that was enough. A few months later, one of my old co-workers, a guy named Rick, reached out. He'd jumped ship after the meltdown and wanted to grab a beer. We met at a small bar downtown, the kind of place that smelled like spilled whiskey and good memories. Rick looked different, tired but lighter. "You hear about George?" he asked. I raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, the $1 million fine kind of gave it away." He shook his head. "No, I mean after that. He's done. Lost both his houses. The third store got bought out for pennies. I heard his wife left too. I took a sip of my beer and let that sink in. It didn't make me happy, and not really. It just made sense. Guys like George always think they can outrun consequences. But the thing about running is, eventually, you trip over your own ego. Rick leaned in. You know, everyone figured you had something to do with it. I just smiled. I didn't do anything he didn't do to himself, he laughed. Well, whatever you didn't do, it worked. That night, walking back to my car, I thought about the last few years. About every late night, every fight with George. Every time I'd wondered if doing the right thing was even worth it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt calm, no more anger, no more what-ifs, just peace. My company kept growing. Word spread that I was the honest tech guy in town, the one who didn't cut corners, who actually cared. I started hiring people, paying them fairly, teaching them everything I knew. Funny thing, I caught myself sounding like a boss sometimes. The good kind. The kind George could have been if he'd had a soul. Years later, I got a call from one of the restaurants I used to service back in the George days. They were upgrading their system and wanted me to handle it. I drove over early, just like old times. And when I walked in, the manager, same guy, a little grayer, shook my hand and said, "You know, I never trusted that company after you left. Glad you're still around." It hit me right there, full circle. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about building something clean in a world full of shortcuts. After the install, I packed up my gear, sat in my truck, and looked out at the morning sun coming up over the parking lot. It was quiet, peaceful. And that's when I realized something simple but true. Revenge doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes the best revenge is success that speaks for itself. George tried to ruin me. He failed. He tried to steal what wasn't his. He lost everything. And me? I built a life out of the ashes he left behind. I'm not saying karma keeps score. But if she does, she's got a hell of a sense of humor. So, yeah. Don't mess with people's money. Don't mess with their integrity. And definitely, don't mess with the guy who knows how all your systems work. Because someday, when the truth finally boots up, you won't like the error message. If you enjoyed this story of real-world revenge and karma finally catching up, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because there are a lot more stories where this came from. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.